She asked for a blanket. The flight attendant gave her a look, glanced at her pregnant belly, then said loud enough for the row to hear, "I think you've got enough insulation already." First class laughed. She didn't. She sat still, a black woman in a tailored dress with dignity thicker than the silence around her. No one stood up for her. Not when they ignored her food order. Not when they served her water in a plastic cup while others drank sparkling juice in crystal. Not when they bumped her leg twice with the food cart, then said, "You dodge well, probably used to it." She never raised her voice, never cried. But something about her presence unsettled the air, like she wasn't just another passenger. Like the way she looked at them said, "You think you know who I am, but you really don't." And they didn't. Not yet. So now I want to know, what would you do if you saw this? Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe some stories deserve to be seen, liked, and shared, you know what to do. Because this one isn't over. Not by a long shot. Zelina Pierce stepped onto the jetway with the deliberate calm of someone used to traveling through corridors built for the powerful. Her stride was steady, though softened by the careful weight of her pregnancy, 7 months along and counting. The Los Angeles morning air had trailed behind her into the cabin like perfume, dry, crisp, full of intent. She adjusted her coat slightly as she passed through the threshold into first class, where cool lighting washed over pristine leather seats and whispers of lavender oil hung in the air like exclusivity. This wasn't her first time in a premium cabin, but today's journey carried more than personal weight. She wasn't just flying for business. She was flying for legacy. As she approached her seat, 2C, aisle, just as she requested, she gently rubbed her abdomen with one hand while balancing her carry-on in the other. The moment her palm brushed the seat's cool armrest, she felt it, the shift. Subtle, but unmistakable. Eyes from across the cabin flicked in her direction, quick and dismissive. The man in 1A stiffened. A woman 3 rows up lowered her magazine an inch. And then there was Marla Vane. Marla had been welcoming every passenger with mechanical warmth, handing out neatly folded blankets, as if they were medals of class. Her uniform was spotless, her posture commanding, and her smile, when she chose to show it, just sharp enough to leave a scratch. She approached Zelina's row, arms filled with blankets, and without missing a beat, handed one to the white businessman in 2B, then to the couple in 3A and 3B. When she reached Zelina's seat, she paused, stared for the briefest moment, and moved on. No blanket. No acknowledgement. Zelina blinked, surprised, then pressed the call button, assuming it was an oversight. When Marla returned, her smile had vanished. "Yes," she asked curtly. "Hi," Zelina said calmly. "I noticed I didn't receive a blanket." Marla tilted her head, feigned confusion, then glanced at Zelina's baby bump. "Oh," she said, tone flat. "I'm not sure you need one. Looks like you're running warm already." Her eyes dragged down Zelina's body with surgical precision, stopping just long enough to land the insult. Zelina's hand gripped the armrest, knuckles widening. She said nothing. Not yet. A few moments passed. Another attendant brought the pre-flight beverage service. Fresh-pressed mango juice, chilled cranberry spritzers, even sparkling elderflower water in elegant glasses. Each passenger received a glass from a silver tray, including the man across from Zelina, who had just requested a second cranberry. But when it was Zelina's turn, Marla returned, this time alone, with a plastic cup filled with plain water. No explanation, no smile, no tray. "For you," she said, placing it in front of Zelina like an offering to a prisoner. "We're still confirming your dietary sensitivities. Better safe than sorry." Zelina glanced down at the cup. Plastic, tepid, no garnish. Around her, passengers sipped their drinks, clinking ice in crystal. She looked back up. "This isn't what I ordered," she said softly. Marla shrugged. "We have to be extra cautious with expecting mothers. You know how easily things upset the stomach." She walked off before Zelina could respond, leaving the cup to sweat on the tray table. The businessman in 2B glanced sideways at her belly, then back to his screen, clearly choosing ignorance over discomfort. Zelina leaned back, her breath catching. It wasn't the water. It wasn't the blanket. It was the message underneath. that her presence here was still a question, that her comfort was optional, that her pregnancy made her not deserving of consideration, but scrutiny. She knew what this was. This wasn't a slip-up. This was ritual. This was the way power tested boundaries quietly, behind the safety of procedure and protocol. Zelina wasn't new to this. But as she stared at the cup of water, one thought burned brighter than the rest. They had no idea who they were humiliating. A low ding echoed through the cabin as the captain announced their climb toward cruising altitude. Outside the window, clouds blurred into a wash of white and blue, but inside, the air was turning thicker with each small insult dressed as oversight. Moments later, the subtle clatter of wheels on laminate signaled Marla's return. She was pushing the food cart down the aisle with mechanical precision, stopping to serve carefully plated meals with artificial grace. Zelina watched as she leaned gently toward each passenger, offering menu descriptions with rehearsed warmth. Then, the cart reached row 2, and suddenly, that warmth evaporated. Without warning, the edge of the cart bumped sharply into Zelina's shin, hard enough to startle, not hard enough to bruise, just enough to remind her she could be touched without consent. Zelina flinched, biting down on a gasp. Marla didn't pause, didn't apologize. She simply looked down, almost mockingly, and kept rolling. 10 seconds later, it happened again, another jolt, this time to the opposite leg, more deliberate, more personal. Zelina shifted in her seat, trying to tuck her legs to the side, to avoid a third blow. Marla glanced down with faux surprise and said, loud enough for 2 nearby passengers to hear, "You move quick. Used to dodging responsibility, I bet." Zelina froze. The couple and 3A exchanged a look. The man raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Zelina didn't respond. She wouldn't, not yet. But her grip on the armrest tightened. She had felt prejudice before, heard it slither through words and gestures, but there was something singularly cruel about being struck while carrying a life, and then mocked for existing in the path. The cart came to a stop, and Marla began plating food for her row. The scent of roasted chicken and buttered vegetables filled the cabin. One by one, the meals were placed with care. She reached the man in 2B, flashed him a smile, even added a small ramekin of extra sauce at his request. When she turned to Zelina, her expression flattened. She reached into the warmer and pulled out a plate, one that had clearly been set aside longer than the others. She placed it down, then turned abruptly and knocked over a small metal spoon, causing a streak of tomato sauce to spatter onto Zelina's slate-gray maternity dress. It landed just below the curve of her belly. Zelina instinctively looked down, her heart skipping not from a stain, but from the implication. "Oh," Marla said with exaggerated concern, then added under her breath, "I thought maternity clothes were easy to clean." Zelina's jaw clenched. She could hear it now, the quiet of other passengers pretending not to notice, the tension that coiled through the cabin like smoke. Some saw, most didn't care. Her dress, tailored with soft stretch and quiet dignity, was now marked, not just with sauce, but with contempt. She took a napkin, dabbed gently, and spoke without looking up. Accidents happen, but patterns? They tend to reveal something deeper. Marla blinked, then narrowed her eyes. "Is there a problem?" "Not yet," Zelina said, her tone cool, controlled, dangerous in its stillness. Marla lingered, just long enough to assert something unspoken, then rolled the cart forward. Zelina took a slow breath. Her plate remained untouched. Her appetite had vanished, replaced by a calculated calm. Across the aisle, the businessman in 1D kept glancing sideways, as if weighing whether to speak or remain safe in silence. He chose the latter, as did everyone else. The flight continued. The minutes dragged. And yet, the weight in Zelina's chest only grew heavier, not from fear, but from something closer to clarity. This wasn't accidental. It was systematic, precise. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. The kind of shift that didn't announce itself with noise, but promised consequences nonetheless. A few rows ahead, the clink of cutlery and the low hum of conversation continued like nothing had happened. Like it was normal, expected, deserved. Zelina reached slowly toward the armrest and pressed the service button. Her water was nearly empty, and she needed a moment, something small, something normal, to remind her she still existed beyond the harassment. The button lit up with a soft ding. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. 15 more. Still no one. Then Marla's voice rang out, not from beside her, but from the front of the cabin. Loud. Intentionally loud. Yes, ma'am? Do you need something? The heads of nearby passengers turned. Zelina didn't answer right away, uncertain if Marla would actually walk over. Instead, the flight attendant cupped her hand near her mouth and projected again, this time louder. Do you need a massage chair? Another pillow? Or maybe a personal nurse? A few chuckles trickled through the cabin. Zelina sat upright, her back rigid against the seat, hands folded neatly in her lap. She said nothing. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Across the aisle, a young man in a blazer glanced away awkwardly. The woman, in 3A, bit her lip, pretending to read. Marla finally approached, her eyes dancing with victory, as if she had landed a punch that the audience approved. She leaned in close enough for Zelina to smell the synthetic vanilla of her perfume and whispered, "Just try to keep things light, ma'am." Then she added, more loudly this time, "It's important for everyone's comfort." Zelina turned her head just slightly. Her voice came low even. "Then maybe start with respecting mine." But Marla was already walking away, the sway in her stride punctuated by self-righteousness. 30 minutes later, the food trays were being cleared. Zelina had barely touched hers. The warmth had long since faded. Marla returned to her row and began collecting dishes from 2B with gloved hands. When she reached Zelina, she paused, slipped off her gloves, and picked up the tray bare-fingered. It was a small move, quiet, but Zelina saw it. So did the man beside her, whose gaze lingered on the now unloved hand. His expression shifted, curiosity giving way to discomfort. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Marla smiled coldly and said, "I figured you'd be fine. I mean, a strong immune system is expected, right? Someone like you." The words slid out like poison dressed in customer service tone. Zelina didn't flinch, but she saw a new passenger, one across the aisle, slowly lower his headphones. He had heard it too. Still, no one spoke, because silence was easier, safer. Zelina shifted slightly, adjusting her spine as if reclaiming the space her body was told it didn't deserve. The air around her felt heavier than pressurization should allow. Marla disappeared toward the galley again, but Zelina knew this was not the end of the show. It was intermission. The ridicule wasn't personal. It was performance. Without a word, the passenger beside her, a kind woman in her early 50s who had smiled at Zelina earlier, was approached by another attendant. There was a hushed conversation, followed by a polite nod, and the woman rose, retrieving her belongings and moving toward another seat in the row behind. Moments later, her replacement arrived. He was in his late 60s, with a stiff posture and the kind of entitlement that wore itself openly. Marla walked just behind him, her smile tight, satisfied. She gestured toward the now vacant seat beside Zelina and said, "Right here, sir. Sorry for the mix-up earlier." The man grunted as he sat, not even glancing at Zelina. She turned slightly, giving him space, trying to breathe past the disruption. A few minutes passed in brittle silence. Then, without warning, the man leaned toward her and muttered, "I hope you're not planning to go into labor during this flight." Zelina blinked once, turned her head slowly, and met his eyes. There was no humor there, only disdain wrapped in fake concern. She said nothing, choosing instead to redirect her gaze toward the window, though her jaw clenched in quiet resistance. Moments later, Marla returned to the row, not to offer anything, but to reach up and adjust the overhead light above Zelina's seat. Without a word, she clicked it on to the highest intensity. The sharp beam cut straight into Zelina's field of vision, reflecting off the tray latch and catching in the corners of her eyes. Zelina raised a hand to shield her face and asked calmly, "Would you mind dimming that a little?" Marla tilted her head, performed a theatrical frown, and said, "Maternity vision tends to be extra sensitive." I read it somewhere. Best not to strain your eyes with too much reading. Zelina stared at her, expression unreadable. I wasn't reading, she replied. Just trying to rest. Marla didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked off, leaving the light blazing. The man beside her shifted, sighing loudly, as if her existence alone was an inconvenience. Around them, the cabin had settled into a polite buzz. Some passengers napping, others watching silent movies, the occasional glass of wine being topped off. Yet the air around Zelina remained off-key. Her seat, once simply a place to travel from point A to point B, had become a stage of passive aggression and silent performances. Every detail, from the seatmate swap to the fluorescent beam now drilling into her skull, was orchestrated not to force confrontation, but to force erosion. Erode her presence, her comfort, her dignity. Zelina leaned back slowly, closing her eyes, not to sleep, but to concentrate. Not to withdraw, but to anchor. She had walked into this plane ready to travel. Now, she was documenting every move, every tactic. Not just in memory, but with the precise mind that had written clauses strong enough to cripple conglomerates. She inhaled deeply, her fingers moving subtly against the soft fabric of her maternity dress. The baby kicked once gently, as if responding to her tension. "We're fine," she whispered, almost inaudibly. "Let them keep showing who they are." With a performative urgency, she returned to Zelina's row under the guise of a security check. She didn't speak at first, only reached upward to the overhead bin with exaggerated caution, unlatched it, and pulled down Zelina's carry-on. The action alone drew attention. A man in 1A glanced up. A woman behind Zelina leaned slightly forward. Marla unzipped the bag and began digging, her hands moving with no real purpose other than to disturb. "What are you doing?" Zelina asked, her tone cool but unmistakably firm. Marla didn't look up. "Routine safety check, ma'am," she said loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "There's been concern about unauthorized items." Zelina's brows lowered. "Concern from whom?" "Just following protocol," Marla replied, extracting a sealed protein bar and holding it up with thinly veiled triumph. "Food products. These aren't permitted in first class under certain international flight guidelines. Especially not homemade-looking ones." She emphasized the last phrase with a smirk. "Is this from home?" she asked, already knowing the answer, not really asking at all. Zelina said nothing. Marla turned slightly and raised her voice. "We've had passengers try to smuggle all kinds of items. I once had a guy bring jerk chicken wrapped in aluminum foil. The whole plane reeked for hours. You'd be surprised what people try to carry on board." A few passengers chuckled awkwardly. The man beside Zelina shifted, pretending to look out the window. The woman in 3A pressed her lips together, clearly uncomfortable but choosing silence. "Do you have any hot sauces, herbs, spices, fermented products?" Marla asked, now clearly taunting. Zelina's voice came sharp this time. "That's enough." Marla looked up, her expression feigning confusion. "Excuse me." "I said that's enough," Zelina repeated. "You've checked. There's nothing here that violates any policy. Now return my bag." Marla hesitated just long enough to assert dominance, then zipped the bag, placed it back in the overhead compartment, and walked off without another word. Zelina adjusted the seatbelt over her stomach, her hand trembling only slightly. Across the aisle, the young man who had earlier avoided eye contact was now watching her with something that looked like respect, or maybe shame. 10 minutes later, Zelina saw Marla in the galley, speaking quietly with a younger flight attendant, who kept glancing back toward Zelina's seat with uncertainty. Something about their exchange was off. Then Marla returned to the flight manager's station at the front of the cabin and tapped on the service tablet mounted near the bulkhead. Zelina couldn't see the screen, but she knew the interface. She had worked with transportation security protocols in regulatory contexts for years. She recognized the body language, the shift in posture, the subtle glance over her shoulder. A flag had been added, and soon after, a new note was printed discreetly and placed into a clipboard. Passenger 2C, behavioral observation recommended. Possible emotional instability. Zelina breathed in slowly. She knew what that meant. It was a soft red flag. It wouldn't remove her. It wouldn't even prompt direct intervention. But it would justify future escalation. Any sign of distress from her could now be interpreted as a medical concern rather than a reaction to abuse. She had just been labeled dangerous, but only quietly, covertly, elegantly. When Marla passed again, she leaned toward her junior colleague and whispered, not low enough, "She's really convinced she belongs up here." Textbook projection. Probably a lawsuit waiting to happen. Zelina heard it. So did the man across from her, whose gaze now held something different, not just discomfort, but the beginnings of disbelief. Zelina adjusted her seat back slightly, not for comfort, but to steady herself. She was being discredited before she could even raise her voice. Every word, every glance, every movement from Marla was no longer emotional to her. It was data. And Marla, drunk on her own unchecked power, was about to hand Zelina her final piece of evidence. 20 minutes had passed since the overhead bin incident when a man in his late 70s entered the first-class cabin mid-flight, supported by a younger flight attendant. He moved slowly, deliberately, with a cane that gleamed silver at the handle. His gait was exaggerated, and his grimace calculated. Zelina had seen this before, people leveraging frailty to assert control. Marla appeared at his side like a loyal shadow, her voice soft yet loud enough to be heard across 2 rows. "We'll get you settled, Mr. Kendrick. So sorry for the inconvenience." The seat change was last minute. Zelina's body didn't move, but her mind immediately connected the dots. There were no available seats in first class. The cabin was full. So where would he be placed? Marla turned toward Zelina's row with rehearsed regret. "Ma'am," she began, her voice laced with insincere sympathy, "we have a bit of a special situation. Mr. Kendrick has severe joint pain and requires a seat closer to the restroom. Yours is the only one suitable. I'm going to ask you to swap with someone in row 7. It's still a good seat." Zelina looked up, deadpan. "I paid for this seat. I requested it specifically due to my pregnancy." Marla nodded as if listening but not truly hearing. "Yes, and we appreciate that. But he's in visible discomfort. And our priority is accommodating urgent health needs." Zelina didn't blink. "And mine?" she asked, cool and quiet. "Does mine qualify?" The man beside her coughed slightly, sensing the crackle in the air. Marla straightened. "We're trying to handle this respectfully, but we really need you to be flexible." "I'm not moving," Zelina said. "If Mr. Kendrick has a condition, perhaps you should have planned ahead instead of displacing paying passengers mid-air." The cabin grew still. Marla's smile vanished. Her next words were spoken louder, as if deliberately performing for an audience. "Well, some people don't understand that flying first class doesn't give them the right to inconvenience others, especially when they barely qualified to be here in the first place." A few heads turned. One woman across the aisle frowned. Zelina stayed silent, her fingers locked together in her lap. Marla stepped back, then whispered something into her headset. Moments later, a male flight supervisor appeared from the cockpit galley, wearing a navy vest and a strained smile. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we understand there's some conflict over seating. I'd like to ask for your cooperation." "I'm in the seat I paid for," Zelina replied calmly. "And I'm being asked to leave it under pretense after being targeted repeatedly." He glanced at Marla, who feigned innocence. "I'm simply following protocol," she said. The supervisor hesitated. "We do have the authority to reseat passengers if a safety or medical accommodation arises." Zelina leaned back, stared up at him. "What's the official policy on displacing a pregnant passenger for a non-emergency request?" The supervisor didn't answer. "You're asking me to give up the one space I specifically reserved for my health," she continued, "to accommodate someone who arrived after boarding and whose condition is being used as a tool. That's not accommodation. That's manipulation." The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. "I'd hate for this to escalate, ma'am." "So would I," Zelina said. "But let's be clear, I'm not escalating. I'm remaining exactly where I'm supposed to be. It's the actions around me that are crossing lines." He opened his mouth, but she cut in, her voice low but firm. Unless you have an official policy you're prepared to cite, I suggest we end this conversation. The supervisor stood still for a long moment. Then he nodded curtly and walked away. Marla glared as she retreated to the galley. Mr. Kendrick grumbled something under his breath and was seated across the aisle. Zelina remained seated, spine straight, gaze fixed forward, her refusal to surrender her place now casting a quiet gravity over her section. Her silence had become more powerful than anyone's words. Across the aisle, the passenger in 2A, a woman in her 40s with an air of media polish and a designer scarf wrapped carelessly around her neck, had been thumbing through her iPad, reading the day's financial headlines. She looked up now, frowning faintly, glancing at Zelina, then back at the glowing screen, as if something had clicked. Her brows lifted slightly. She leaned sideways and spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for the nearby rows to catch. Excuse me. I don't mean to intrude, but are you Zelina Pierce? Zelina turned her head, startled, but composed. Yes, she said simply, not offering more. The woman tilted her screen, revealing a headline from the Financial Report Weekly. Zelina Pierce, the architect behind the $700 million aviation deal poised to reshape first-class standards. Her voice carried a mix of awe and realization. I just read this 10 minutes ago. You're the legal executive representing the Atlas Equity Group in the Atlantic Air acquisition, aren't you? The hum of conversation across the cabin died instantly. You could almost hear the recognition spreading like static. A couple in row 3 exchanged glances. A businessman lowered his newspaper with a quiet wait. What? Zelina didn't smile. She only nodded once and said, I am. The woman in 2A sat back in her seat, visibly processing. I didn't realize. That you were on this flight. Involved with this airline. Her voice had dropped in volume, but not intensity. From the front of the cabin, Troy, the flight operations manager, appeared, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to read the sudden shift in atmosphere. He approached slowly, cautiously, like a man realizing he might have stepped into a fire wearing gasoline. Is there an issue? He asked, his tone forced neutral. The woman in 2A held up her iPad. Only if you consider your company humiliating one of the lead architects behind a $700 million contract and issue. Troy blinked, visibly rattled. I'm sorry, who? Zelina looked up at him, without moving an inch. Zelina Diane Pierce, partner counsel for Atlas Equity. This airline was set to close a joint operations agreement with our fund in less than 48 hours. My presence on this flight was meant to be anonymous. I was observing the onboard experience firsthand before signing off on final compliance. Her words weren't angry. They were clinical, crisp, and undeniable. Troy's mouth opened, then closed. Behind him, Marla had frozen mid-step, the tray in her hand slightly tilted. Someone coughed near the rear of the cabin. Another passenger whispered, Did she say 700 million? Zelina continued, her voice calm. I didn't come here to be recognized, and certainly not to be harassed. But since that objective has clearly failed, I suppose I no longer need to remain quiet. Marla stepped forward, stiffly, trying to regain footing. Ms. Pierce, I had no idea who you were, and that's the problem, Zelina said, her eyes cutting through her like a scalpel. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me better. But now that you do, suddenly the rules change. A hollow silence filled the space around them. Troy looked at the iPad, still glowing in the woman's lap. His face had gone pale. Zelina didn't move. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. Her authority now filled the cabin without the need for volume. I'll be noting every moment of this flight in my final report, she said quietly. Starting from the moment you tried to displace a pregnant woman under false pretenses, to the moment you allowed discriminatory behavior to escalate unchecked. And now, she turned slowly to face Marla, you've handed me something no clause could have provided. A case study in live failure. She looked out the window for a moment, then back toward the front of the plane. So, we'll see where this lands. The silence that followed Zelina's revelation wasn't the silence of discomfort anymore. It was the sharp, sudden stillness of realization. The kind that cuts through ambient noise and flattens breath. A young man 2 rows behind reached into his blazer, pulled out his phone, and began typing. A second later, his voice pierced the hush, low but incredulous. "She's legit. Zelina Pierce. Top of her field. There's an entire expose about her in Forbes last month. She's overseeing the Atlas Atlantic merger." Heads turned faster now. Someone else whispered, $700 million. That's the number. That's her deal. A ripple of recognition spread across the cabin like wildfire. A man in 3B pulled off his headphones, turned to his wife, and mouthed, "We screwed up." Behind them, a woman in a black blazer muttered, "They let Marla treat her like that? Jesus." At the center of it all, Zelina remained still, her gaze unflinching. She didn't need to speak again. The facts were louder than any retaliation. Troy, now visibly sweating, took a step forward as if to regain control, but his words fumbled before they formed. "MS. Pierce, I deeply regret." She cut him off gently but firmly. "Don't apologize. It's too early for that." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it was resolute. "You're not sorry. You're exposed." She shifted her posture slightly, easing the weight on her spine. "You didn't see value in me when I boarded this plane." That was the truth before any name came into it. Marla, still holding a napkin in her hand, had gone pale. Her lips opened as if to say something, but no sound followed. Zelina finally turned toward her, calm and exacting. "Do you understand now why every time you withheld service, every time you made me a spectacle, every time you tried to humiliate me with a smile, you weren't just insulting a passenger?" Marla blinked. Zelina leaned forward slightly, not threatening, but commanding. "You were mocking the very process your company begged to be part of." Someone near the cockpit gasped audibly. "She's the one holding the pen." Zelina didn't nod. She didn't need to confirm what everyone already understood now. "You made assumptions about where I belonged," she said. "And now you've forced a spotlight onto the very truth you tried to ignore." A few rows behind, Colin Drexler, the businessman who had previously chuckled under his breath when Zelina boarded, sank deeper into a seat, his eyes cast down. Someone nearby murmured, "This is going to cost the company everything." Zelina heard it, and she let it sit. The weight of consequence didn't need her help to fall. She spoke again, not for vengeance, but for clarity. "For the record, I wasn't here to inspect the product. I was here to understand the culture." Her voice sharpened just slightly, because no matter how new the seat covers are or how wide the legroom gets, if a pregnant black woman in first class is still seen as a threat, then the upgrade is only cosmetic. No one laughed. No one dared. In the cockpit, a quiet notification dinged on the pilot screen. Internal communications had already begun. The back-end team at Atlantic Air was receiving real-time alerts. Pierce identified on Flight 714. Issue escalation protocol triggered. Zelina reached into her purse and pulled out a slim leather folder. Unmarked, precise. She opened it slowly, revealing a single embossed card. With deliberate calm, she handed it to Troy. "That's my liaison. She'll expect your legal department's cooperation within the hour. There will be a review of every incident on this flight." Troy took the card like it burned. Marla stood frozen, her expression hollow. Zelina turned back to her seat and said, "This conversation is over." Zelina remained seated, her tablet tucked neatly into her bag, her breathing measured, her posture relaxed in a way that unsettled the very people who had dismissed her hours earlier. Troy's hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the cockpit handset, pretending to check final protocols, though his mind was already spiraling through legal fallout, potential suspension, and headlines he wouldn't be able to control. At the same time, Marla stood stiffly in the galley, not daring to face the passengers again, her cheeks blotched with a dull flush of exposed ego. A soft ding echoed through the plane, signaling that passengers could begin deplaning. But no one wanted to be the first to walk past her. In the executive suite of Atlantic Air's New York headquarters, An emergency meeting had already begun via encrypted channels. A senior risk officer stared blankly at a screen displaying a real-time email from Atlas Equity. Contract review suspended pending internal ethics audit. Effective immediately. Lead counsel Zelina Pierce. Another tab showed market data in free fall. Atlantic Air stock had dropped 11.2% in pre-market activity. News algorithms had picked up the name Zelina Pierce and were connecting it to every pending merger, every strategic partnership, every quarterly forecast. The public didn't know exactly what had happened on Flight 714. Not yet. But investors knew enough. The damage was already compounding. Inside the plane, a soft female voice came through the intercom. This time from the captain herself. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us. Please remain seated as we prepare for gate departure. On behalf of our crew, we wish you a safe onward journey." It was the only voice on the plane that carried no guilt. Zelina stood calmly as the aisle cleared. She didn't rush. She didn't glance back. When she stepped off the aircraft, her phone buzzed once. A message from her deputy counsel. "They're already pulling PR. Want me to issue a statement?" She replied with a single sentence. "No. Let silence do the talking." Outside the terminal, her driver stood waiting beside a black sedan, engine running, door already open. As she slid into the back seat, her assistant handed her a printed memo. It was from Atlantic Air's internal operations team, leaked just minutes earlier. The subject line read, "Flight 714 Internal Conduct Review Urgent." Below, highlighted in yellow, was the key quote, "This isn't about compliance anymore. It's about character. We didn't lose the contract because we failed to meet a checklist. We lost it because we forgot how to treat people." Marla's name appeared halfway down the document. So did Troy's. Both marked, "Suspended pending further review." Further down, a separate note from the board's legal advisor. "Request review of board member Colin Drexler's on-flight behavior. Possible breach of DI policy." Back at the gate, as new passengers began to board the next flight, a few flight attendants whispered among themselves. One of them, a junior named Kaylee, shook her head. "Did you see her walk out?" she asked. "Didn't flinch. Didn't curse. Didn't even look back." Another replied, "She didn't have to." She already knew the room was collapsing behind her. Inside the cockpit, the pilot finished his post-flight checklist, then looked at the flight log. He added a short line at the bottom of the incident report. "Passenger 2C no disruption. No assistance requested. Presence noted." In a quiet corner of the Atlantic Air intranet, a staff memo was circulating faster than management could contain it. It wasn't signed, just a single paragraph with no official formatting, but it resonated like gospel. "We didn't lose $700 million because of one bad flight. We lost it because we assumed people only matter when they wear a title. And when that assumption finally met reality at 38,000 feet, reality won." As the car pulled away from the airport curb, Zelina looked out the window, the skyline rising steadily in the distance. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't need to. What she felt was something deeper, precise, weighted, finished. Her phone buzzed again. A colleague from Atlas had messaged a single sentence. "How do you want to handle the press?" Zelina typed slowly, deliberately, with dignity, "Which is more than they gave me." 2 weeks had passed since the landing, but the tremors left behind by Flight 714 still echoed quietly through boardrooms, inboxes, and conference calls. The headlines had cooled, replaced by newer scandals and fresher news, but inside Atlantic Air, the silence after the storm had become a mirror, one that forced people to look at themselves. Marla Vane stood backstage in a modest event hall in Chicago, nervously smoothing the sleeves of her blazer. She hadn't worn her flight uniform in days. Officially, she was still on administrative leave, but today wasn't about job titles. Today was about facing something harder than policy, perspective. The event was titled Implicit Bias in High Places, hosted by an independent diversity council. She hadn't been invited. She had asked to be there. When her name was called, she stepped onto the small stage, palms damp, heart pounding, not from fear of being judged, but from knowing that judgment was overdue. She took the mic and looked out over the small crowd, flight crew, customer service reps, a few executives in folded sleeves trying to blend in. Then she spoke. "I used to think I was just following procedure," she began, voice steadier than she expected. "But all I was doing was dressing up my assumptions in protocol." There was no applause, just silence. Listening. She took a breath. "I believed that training made me fair. That experience made me right. But on that flight, I didn't see a woman. I didn't see a mother. I saw my own prejudice reflected in her presence. And I disguised it as control." Her throat tightened. "And I got away with it until I didn't." She stepped back from the mic, not to escape, but to let her words settle. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't expect it. But change had to start somewhere. And for her, it started here. Elsewhere in Atlantic Air's HR department, Troy Hensley had submitted a formal request for departmental transfer. He no longer wanted to oversee operations. Instead, he wanted to lead an initiative for ethical leadership and bias intervention. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who once tried to remove a pregnant passenger from her seat in the name of logistics now spent his days writing policy drafts about inclusion, about humanity, about how power must never shield cruelty. His proposal for a training series titled Passengers First, People Always, was under internal review, but gaining quiet momentum. And in a quiet suburb outside Seattle, Colin Drexler sat at his kitchen table, rereading a letter that had arrived 3 days earlier. It was an acceptance letter for his daughter, awarded a full scholarship to a STEM program funded by a foundation created by Zelina Pierce. There was no mention of Flight 714, no note of recognition, just a signature at the bottom, Z.P. For the first time in years, Colin felt something unfamiliar to him, shame not wrapped in defensiveness, but in reflection. He had called her a diversity placement in front of his peers once. Now his child's future was being made possible by the same woman he had refused to see. That night, he wrote a letter, not out of obligation, but from somewhere deeper. "Dear MS. Pierce," it began. "Thank you for choosing value over vanity, for seeing potential where others saw position, for reminding people like me that real privilege isn't about priority boarding or lounge access. It's about being given a chance to grow, even when we didn't earn it." He signed it, folded it, and left it unmailed. Not because he changed his mind, but because some truths are less about delivering and more about understanding. And Zelina? She never commented publicly on Flight 714, never gave an interview, never wrote an op-ed, never tweeted a single word. But her actions spoke in volumes. Within a month, her office announced a new review clause in all aviation investments, requiring random cultural experience audits on every executive-level flight. Internally, they called it the 714 Clause. Externally, it became policy. And as for the people on that flight, the passengers who watched and said nothing, the crew who stood idle, the leaders who followed orders, they each carried something different now. Not guilt, not shame, but awareness. A woman had entered their world quietly, endured their worst, and left them with no blood on her hands, but all their fingerprints on the truth. And from that truth, some finally began to build better versions of themselves. The end. If this story made you feel something, anger, hope, or just the weight of truth, don't forget to like and subscribe. We've got more stories that dig deep into the things people don't always talk about, but should. What part hit you the hardest? Was it the silence, the power shift, or something in between? And where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment and let's talk. Your thoughts matter more than views.